This year seems to have broken all the records in terms of the weather. Now, we started with the driest and warmest winter that we've had for decades, and then we went into the wettest and coldest spring that we've had for a century, and then the summer, what bit we had of it, in July it was wet, and it followed a very wet and miserable June as well. Now that has an impact on the crops that we grow ourselves, but also it has an impact on the wild foods that we go foraging for as well. So what we've come down to do here in Lottie's Wood, which is a woodland next to our village in Sunnyside, is we're going to have a look at some of the wild foods that we go picking and see what the weather has caused, whether it's caused them to grow better or whether it's actually stopped them from growing at all. Well, we're going to start with the good news, and that's the hazel. Now, as you can see, lots of hazelnuts on the tree here. Now that's important to us, very important, because hazel is one of the most important crops that we pick in the autumn. Hazelnuts are full of essential oils, but also very high in protein, so it's always one of the big crops that I go out and pick in September and October time. They produce catkins in the early spring, and they are wind pollinated. They're not dependent on the bees to come out and pollinate them. And what we think has happened is that the catkins were out when it was still the dry end and sunny end of the winter and early spring. They beat the heavy rains. Well, this is a Rowan, sometimes called mountain ash, and quite popular with councils for planting because they have a lot of nice blossom in the spring, and they come out with these bunches of red berries in the late summer and autumn. They're slightly later this year. Really useful for making a jelly with. They're very high in pectin. They have a very bitter taste to them, so you can't eat them raw, but cooked in jellies they're very good. Crop this year is not too bad. I've seen better, but I have already been out to pick some of these and already used them for making a jelly, so this one not too bad. Well, these are blackberries. Now, when I was a kid, the blackberry picking season used to be a lot later than it is now. We used to have half term at school was known as Blackberry Week, which was in October. In more recent years, the blackberries have been ripening up here in late July, and I've been picking them throughout August. Well, this year, we're now at the end of August, and I've barely found any ripe ones at all. Now, the overall crop seems to be reasonable. It's not fantastic, but one of the interesting things is that the weather seems to have knocked them back, certainly in the timing that they've taken to ripen compared to recent years. Oddly, compared to what it was a few decades ago, it's more on a natural cycle that you would expect from blackberries. Nevertheless, blackberries are important to us because they're very juicy, and therefore they're very good for adding into jellies to use the juice in them, and also good for pies and crumbles. So at the minute we haven't had any blackberry pies, but I'm hoping to have one or two of those in the next few days. Well, these three trees here are cherry trees. Now, normally by the end of June, early July, then the cherry crop is more or less gone. If you haven't picked them yourself, then the wood pigeons have normally got them. But this year there have been hardly any cherries. Now, I suspect it's not necessarily down to the weather. What we think is happening is that they've been blighted by some kind of fungus, and these trees here, they've still got their leaves on, but behind me you can see that a lot of the leaves have gone from the trees. Now, it's the end of August, and the trees should still be covered in leaves, and it's some kind of fungus, we think, that's actually blighting the cherry trees. So we've had no cherry crop at all this year. These are sloes, or blackthorn, and last year and the year before we had a really good crop of sloes, and this year there is hardly anything on any of the sloes. sloe bushes that I've seen in any of the hedgerows or any of the woodlands, and we think that that was the one that was the victim of the heavy rains in the spring. Basically, they were out flowering just as the heavy rains were falling, and the flowers and the blossom got absolutely hammered. If it didn't get hammered by the rain, then the bees weren't coming out, the pollinators weren't coming out, and therefore there has been virtually no sloes this year. So unfortunately, there's going to be no sloe gin this year either. Now this is a hawthorn, and in the late summer and the autumn the hawberries come out, and you can see a few of them here. Now this year obviously there are some hawberries available to pick, but not that many. It's certainly, compared to previous years, the crop is going to be a lot less this time. Now hawberries are very good for making jellies, and they're very high in pectin. So we use them in making things like hedgerow jelly, where we add them into fruits such as blackberries, which are low in pectin. Helps them to set, helps the jellies to set. We will be able to pick some of these this year, but there's just not going to be the quantity that we had last year. So again, this is one that's been hit by the spring rains. Hawthorne flowers in May, and it got a real hammering from the heavy rains. We don't pick acorns very often. We have once or twice made flour from the acorns. Now these are quite young trees, and last year they did have acorns on these oak trees. This year I've not seen any. Now I've not done a full check on all the mature oak trees in the area, so it may be that it's just these young oaks that aren't producing any acorns. But I've just spotted, as we've got here, what looks like some kind of fungus or mildew that's killing all the young leaves, which is a bit worrying, because I look over that side as well, and I can see oak trees, and it looks as though something's affecting the young leaves on those trees as well. So I don't know what it is. It could be just that it's just this woodland that's having a problem, or it may be sort of general weather conditions that have caused this. Every August I come over to here, which is the Tanfield Railway footpath. It runs next to our village of Sunnyside, and the reason I'm attracted here is because of this tree. Now this is an apple tree, and normally in August and September it would take me 5 minutes to fill a carrier bag full of apples and then just pop home with them. There isn't a single apple on this tree. It's nothing to do with somebody having beaten me to picking the apples. No apples developed on this tree at all, and it's the same up and down the country. The apple crop has been smashed to smithereens by the weather, and it's not just the ordinary apples, it's the crab apples as well. I've checked them on the hedgerows, and there's virtually no crab apples at all. This really is a victim of this year's awful weather, and it's going to cause us an awful lot of problems later in the year, because we use apples in a lot of our cooking and a lot of our preserves, so we're going to have to find alternatives. And in the meantime, the wildlife that relies on a lot of the fruit that grows wild as well, they're going to have a problem this autumn and winter as well, because their food supply has been substantially diminished. This is elder, and you can see some of the elderberries just starting to form up there. Now this year the elderflower was extremely late. Normally we'd be looking at mid to late June as being the end of the elderflower season, and I'll be rushing out to pick the elderflower to make the last elderflower drop scones or the elderflower champagne. Well, this year it was July when the elderflower was flowering. Now that made it a bit easier for me to go out and pick it for making the champagne, but these would normally now be much more ripe than they are, and there'd be an awful lot more berries on these bunches than there are now. So yes, we will get an elderberry crop, but it's not going to be anywhere near as good as it normally is. And again, that's a bit of a problem for us, because the elderberries are really good for juice, which we can use in making syrups and jams and jellies. As I say, we will get some elderberry, but not a great deal. And again, it's one of those that seems to have fallen victim to the weather. Not as badly as the apples have, but nevertheless it's not as good as it normally is. And again, the wildlife is going to suffer, because the elderberries are very popular with things like thrushes and the blackbirds in the autumn, and without that crop, that food, they're going to suffer over the winter as well. Well, these are rose hips, and actually the rose hips aren't doing too badly this year. These are the fruit of the roses. Very high in vitamin C, and actually this afternoon I used a whole load of them to make some rosehip syrup. Well, that's it in terms of our wild food foraging at the end of August. It is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of it is doing rather well, such as the hazel, but some of the really important crops, such as the apples, have been absolutely hammered by the weather. So that's going to have an impact on the wildlife, and it also has an impact on our food supply as well. So we're going to have to look at alternatives, but we fight on to live another day.